of a part-time, long-distance marriage, held together by frequent cross-country trips back and forth as time allowed, and one family vacation together each year. For Kerney, it wasn't a happy prospect. He looked over the plains. The green landscape was pleasing to the eye, deeper in color than the bunch grasses of New Mexico, but under a less vivid sky. He could see a small herd of grazing livestock moving toward a windmill, the outline of a remote ranch house beyond, and the thin line of the state road that plowed straight across the plains and curved sharply up the distant mountains. He settled behind the wheel and gave the car some juice, thinking it would be a hell of a lot more fun to drive on to Paso Robles in a little two-seater with the top down and the wind in his face. Kerney arrived in Paso Robles and promptly got lost trying to find the ranch. A convenience store clerk pointed him in the right direction, and a few minutes later he was traveling a narrow paved road through rolling hills of vineyards, cattle ranches, and horse farms, sheltered by stands of large oak trees amid lush carpets of green grass. He drove with the window down, finding the moist sea air that rolled over the coastal mountains a welcome change from the dry deserts of New Mexico. He'd been offered free lodging at the ranch, along with a tour when he arrived, and he was eager to see how the outfit operated. The condition of the horses would tell him most of what he needed to know before deciding whether to buy, but the people who cared for the animals and their surroundings would also indicate whether his money would be well spent. Kerney turned a corner onto a wide open vista, eased the car off the pavement, and got out to take in the scenery. On a hilltop behind and above him stood a large, mission-style villa with a portal consisting of a series of arches supported by Georgian columns and topped off with a red tile roof and overhanging eaves. Paired bell towers with identical arches rose above either end of the second story. 2 vineyards cascaded down the gentle slope on both sides of the villa. Taken as a whole, the place reeked of wealth. To the west, densely treed coastal mountains rose up from a green, rolling valley that wandered down to a creek bed. A sign fronting the ranch road into the valley announced the Double J Ranch. In a series of fenced and gated pastures, brood mares and their foals gathered under shady oak trees. The ranch headquarters bordered the creek bed and consisted of 4 white houses around a semicircular driveway within a few steps of a birthing barn and a long row of covered open-air stalls adjacent to small paddocks. Beyond the stalls was a barn, which Kerney guessed was used to house the stud horses. Sarah had asked for pictures, so Kerney got the camera from his travel bag and took some shots, doing a rough mental count of the mares and foals in plain view. There were more than 100, signifying a very large breeding operation. He drove to the ranch and parked near the birthing barn, which had a small office building off to one side. A man in his early 40s stepped onto the porch as Kerney approached. "Mr. Hilt?" Kerney asked as he approached. The man nodded. "The name's Devon," he said with a welcoming smile, extending his hand. "You must be Kevin Kerney." Kerney smiled back and shook Devon's hand. "Thanks for putting me up. I'm afraid you'll have to share the guest house with another party," Hilt said. "The boss has a buyer coming up from Santa Barbara sometime later today." "That's not a problem," Kerney said as he took a look around. "This is quite a place." Hilt laughed. He stood 6 feet tall in his cowboy boots and had a sturdy frame topped off with curly brown hair cut short. "This isn't the half of it. Around the bend a mile away we've got a training track, stables and pastures for colts and 2-year-olds. That's where the boss, his wife, his mother, and the ranch manager have their houses. This area is just for my family, the trainers and guests." "It's pretty posh," Kerney said. "I can't remember ever seeing a more beautiful ranch." Hilt laughed again. "It does make working for a living a bit more pleasant." He pointed down the driveway to a pitched-roof, single-story clapboard house surrounded by a picket fence. "That's a guest cottage. Want to settle in first or take that tour I promised you?" "Let's do the tour," Kerney said. "Perfect," Hilt replied as he moved toward the pickup truck. Hilt drove Kerney around the spread, passing on bits of information along the way. It was a quarter-horse ranch with about 400 head and a breeding program that foaled more than 100 newborns yearly. 4 stallions at stud were syndicated at more than $1 million each. Most of the horses were owned by the ranch. The owner, Jeffrey Jardin, lived most of the time in Southern California, where he owned a high-tech manufacturing business with major defense and military contracts. But his passion was racehorses, and the ranch showed that he pursued it seriously. Kerney guessed the size of the spread at about 500 acres. He wondered what the value of the land was on the pricey California market. Hilt told Kerney that in the morning he'd meet Ken Wheeler, a former jockey who oversaw the operation and culled the horses that weren't suitable for racing. Kerney hoped he'd find what he was looking for: 2 riding horses for personal use, 1 stud to service Jack Burke's mares, and some 2- or 3-year-old geldings Riley Burke could train as cutting horses. Tucked into a separate part of the valley, away from the road, stood the training track and a set of fenced pastures that held good-looking colts and 2-year-olds. Open-air, covered stalls, and a barn stood adjacent to the track. At one end of the stalls, a circular pen contained a hot walker. Driven by an electrical motor, the device had 4 arms that looked like oversized propeller blades mounted on a triangular-shaped base. After training runs, the horses were hitched to the arms and mechanically walked to cool them down. On a hill overlooking the track were 3 houses. One, a 2-story Victorian with a low-pitched hipped roof and spindlework porch railings. It was flanked by 2 modest single-story houses built with wood cladding and brick. All were nicely landscaped and sheltered by oak trees. As Hilt pulled to a stop in front of the barn, he pointed at a smaller Victorian house on the far side of the track. "That's where Ken lives," he said. "He'll meet you at the office tomorrow at 7. Want to look at some pretty horses?" "You bet," Kerney said as he climbed out of the truck. Hilt spent the better part of an hour walking Kerney through the barn, stalls, and into several nearby pastures. The horses were slick and well cared for, and the grounds, barns, and stalls were clean and tidy. Kerney learned that the ranch employed a full-time veterinarian, 2 tech assistants, 2 trainers, and a variety of stable hands, groomers, exercise riders, and laborers, many of them Mexican. Low-cost housing was provided for a dozen key employees. The 2 men entered a pasture, and several colts came trotting over to greet them. Hilt recited their bloodlines, while Kerney gave them the once-over. He found himself enjoying Hilt's company and the talk of horses. He stroked a chestnut colt's neck and ran a hand over its withers, thinking it was decidedly refreshing to get away by himself and forget about being a cop. Back at the guest cottage, Kerney found an overnight bag and briefcase on the floor of the largest bedroom, but no sign of the man who was sharing the accommodations with him. He dumped his stuff in another bedroom and looked around the cottage. Whoever decorated the place had a penchant for green and an obsession with frogs. The carpet, wallpaper, tile work, and even the kitchen ceiling were all various shades of green. Ceramic, glass, and pottery figurines of frogs sat on every table, dresser, and countertop, and framed prints of jumping frogs, singing frogs, and comical-looking standing frogs hung on the walls of each room. It seemed like a big, silly joke that had gotten slightly out of hand. Still, it made him smile. The kitchen was fully equipped and stocked, but Kerney decided to take himself out to dinner and do a little sightseeing before it got dark. Hilt had told him of a good restaurant in a nearby village and given him directions. Kerney changed into a fresh shirt, fired up the rental car, and drove away, pleased with how the day had gone. Always an early riser, Kerney was up at 5. He showered, dressed, and sat on the porch of the guest cottage in the cool pre-dawn air, drinking a glass of juice and enjoying the sounds of whinnying mares in a nearby pasture. Last night, after an early dinner, he'd driven to the ocean in time to watch a spectacular, romantic sunset, which only made him miss Sarah's company. When he'd returned to the ranch, an imported luxury sedan was parked in front of the cottage, and the door to his bunkmate's bedroom was closed. To avoid disturbing the man,